Good afternoon from the middle of Jerusalem. This is Dan Diker, President of Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. I'm here with my dear friend and colleague, Lieutenant Colonel Reserve Maurice Hirsch. This is a Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs daily brief assessment on the ongoing Hamas-Israel war in Gaza following the October 7th atrocities. And the conflict is become really an international conflict, which is why it is so critically important to carve out the context as to what is happening. We're facing, this is a global assault, not only against the state of Israel, the Jewish people, but really Western civilization, as we've just been discussing with our friend, Reverend Canon Brian Cox, who's the president of the Institute for Faith-Based Diplomacy based in Washington, D.C. Reverend Canon Cox has almost 50 years of experience with Israel and the Middle East. He's been involved in multiple faith-based diplomacy issues across a number of different countries and peoples and communities and ethnicities. And we couldn't be more delighted to welcome you today, Canon Cox. We're going to ask Maurice just to give us 2 minutes of update. There is an update day. It's been a very difficult day of fighting, Maurice, in the southern Gaza Strip, opposite the Hamas leadership there.
In both areas, Dan, there has been really quite intensive fighting going on from yesterday afternoon, evening, and into this morning. Yesterday was probably one of the most difficult days for Israel and our forces. We lost 7 soldiers yesterday in the fighting. The death toll really mounting all the time, unfortunately. But the forces are making good progress. Also completely cutting off Savagery, going into in the northern Gaza Strip, going into one of Hamas's strongholds and one of the operational centers, and also going south to Khan Yunis and into that southern area with, as we reported yesterday, tanks already moving towards the homes of Hamas leaders like Yahya Sinwar. This is something which appears to be really an upgraded scale and timeline for the fighting, with really the pressure to make sure that this war does not go on for months and months, but rather comes to a quick end. Yesterday, we also saw a massive barrage of rockets being fired from Gaza at Israel's civilian population to the heartland, Tel Aviv and Petah Tikva, that entire area of the coastal area, and then with those rocket launchers then being almost immediately destroyed. On the northern front, we're continuing on with Hezbollah and Iran's proxy, still with that constant war of attrition on a low level, but still there all the time as a thorn in our sides. Judea and Samaria, again, operations continuing along, terrorists being arrested really by the dozen every single day, and those activities really supporting the war in the south to make sure that the terrorists from Hamas and the other terrorist organizations that are the same organizations in Judea and Samaria don't raise their heads and cannot be the sources of other terror attacks, as we saw last Thursday.
One important strategic point that you've just raised now, and that Khalid Abu Tuameh and I just raised in the podcast Our Middle East, which we did at JNS, is to say that the Iranian regime strategy using the Hamas was to cut Israel into 2 or 3 different sectors, to cut us actually in half by going up the coast, across to Judea and Samaria, raiding major cities, up the coast, and then invading Judea and Samaria as well, and getting the Arab population there enervated, incited. So they were really going to try to create an implosion within Israel by taking hostages across the country. This is not just a war of the imagination. This was actually the plan.
Well, I think you really have to put that also into very specific context, Dan. If we heard the calls of the U.S. Vice President of Kamala Harris, saying that we have to reinstate this idea of a safe passage between Gaza and Judea and Samaria and the West Bank. That's exactly the point. I worked on that idea in the late 90s. The terrorists couldn't understand, well, why won't we be able to get on a bus in Gaza City, go through Israel's heartland, with our guns and with our bombs and just get off the other side. That really is what Vice President Harris is suggesting that Israel agree to. That's exactly what they were trying to do. Connect Gaza with Judea and Samaria, cut Israel into two, and then have the pressure also coming from
this was one of the original ideas, and you know this because you were involved in the Oslo negotiations and the Oslo implementation. Yeah, you're not that old, right?
Not that old.
But this was the original idea of the Oslo Accords, which is why under your supervision, the Oslo at 30 critique that the viewers can get on jcpa.org for free in English has been really proven to have been a grand strategic mistake. And that with the JCPA in the Palestinian Authority Reform and Accountability and Reform Initiative we are moving towards other alternatives, also for Gaza and also as we move forward for Judea and Samaria. We want to now discuss the context of the October 7th atrocities and the ongoing war with Canon Cox. Canon, you have been in this part of the world and in Israel many, many, many times. And you said to us just before we went live here on the webinar that you don't remember in your lifetime a time of such great stress and urgency and danger, frankly, for Jews, for Christians, for Western civilization. Help us understand your thinking as a Christian leader who knows the Middle East very, very well.
Thank you, Dan and Maurice. I'm happy to be with you. Let me give you a little bit of context without going at great length. I've also had some 26 years of experience in the Muslim world, which has included interaction with the Islamist movement in places like India and Pakistan with Jamaat Islami, and in Jordan with the Muslim Brotherhood that I worked with for some 13 years. And during that time, I met and got to know 3 of the founders of Hamas in Jordan. So I'm somebody who's actually interacted with Hamas, and I'm somebody who's actually been to Gaza, albeit prior to the time that Hamas took over in 2007. But that informs my understanding of what's actually going on. One of the things that Israel needs to think about is long-term, and that is really building a global network of allies. And I think you have many potential allies in the global Christian community, particularly in the global South, and these need to be actively cultivated. This is very important. And I think there's a lot of, shall we say, spiritual pressure and energy in the global Christian community to want to stand with Israel. But people in the Christian community don't really know what that means. It isn't just wearing a T-shirt with an Israeli flag on it. You know, these are nice gestures, but they're not of that much benefit to Israel. So what does it mean really for the global Christian community to stand with Israel and the Jewish people? First, there's 2 things they need to know, and this is very important. They need to know that this is not another chapter of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is a conflict between Israel and Hamas, and actually, in a larger sense, between Israel and a global network of anti-Semitic actors. And what October 7th has done, it has brought these people out into the open. So you have this coalition of Islamists, of Western progressives, of neo-Nazis, and Black radical activists who have suddenly come out of from the darkness and so you have this network of anti-Semitic actors. I'm seeing a level of anti-Semitism in the US that I've never seen in my lifetime. And it's deeply, deeply disturbing. So part of getting involved in a conflict is understanding what the conflict is about. This is not about the Israeli-Palestinian issue. This is a conflict between Israel and a global network of anti-Semitic actors whose simple goal is the destruction of Israel. The second thing they need to know is that Israel has a moral imperative to destroy evil. And this is what many Christians struggle with. It's natural for them to want to pray for peace, to encourage a ceasefire, to minimize casualties. This is normal thinking. The idea that there's actually an obligation to defeat evil is something that is struggled with in the Christian community. And so in terms of coming to terms with that, that's something that they need to know and understand. Now, there's 4 things that the global Christian community can do to stand with Israel. First of all, they need to express settled opposition to anti-Semitism. Now, it's one thing to tolerate free speech, and we certainly don't want to stifle free speech. At the same time, there has to be a zero tolerance policy in terms of anti-Semitism. And often people may not agree with the anti-Semitism that's being expressed even from members of our own Congress, but they tolerate it. It's called passive opposition. But there has to be much more active opposition to the anti-Semitism. And this means calling it out. It means public shaming of these individuals. It's very interesting that these Harvard students who were out there chanting from the river to the sea, when their names and pictures were finally being posted, they began to scatter like cockroaches, because they had been publicly shamed. So one of the ways that we can stand with Israel is to take a more settled opposition, more assertive rather than passive, and realize that this is something we've seen before in the 1930s of Germany, and we know how that turned out. So we have to take it seriously. The second thing that Christians can do is to work for strategic friendship between Israel and their own nation. And this is an opportunity, working with members of the Jewish community in their own nation to begin to actively talk to their own political leaders about making strategic friendship with Israel in a part of their foreign policy. And I know many Christians in Africa, they say, well, I love Israel, I pray for Israel. I said, well, but your nation never stands with Israel. Whenever Israel is facing condemnation in the United Nations, your nation votes against Israel. So what good does that do? I said, you need to take a more active role. And so this is one of the ways, the opportunity to build strategic friendship between Israel and their own particular nation. The third thing that Christians can do and is to pray for Reformation in Islam. And one of the things that I think most people don't realize is that the Islamist narrative is the most influential narrative in the Muslim world. And at the sword point of the Islamist narrative is hatred of the Jews and hatred of Israel. It's interesting. I work a lot in India, and I have worked in Pakistan, and most Muslims there have never met a Jew, have never been to Israel, and yet they hate them. It's an irrational sort of thing, but it's there. And that has to be transformed. Part of the Reformation of Islam is not taking the secularist approach like Europe, but rather to enable the Islamic world to reattach to its Jewish roots. This will be an important part of reform in the Muslim world, and I could say a lot more, but I'm supposed to be brief today. The final thing has to do with our relationships with the Palestinian Christian community. And I have a long-time relationship with the Palestinian Christian community. I know people across the board, including even two of the authors of the BDS initiative. And as an Anglican, I've known most of the bishops and many of the clergy, and my own congregation has relationships with congregations in Ramallah and Nablus and Nazareth. And obviously, one of the strongest elements of Palestinian Christian identity is seeing themselves as victims. And they will talk quite eloquently about being victims of the Israeli occupation. And this has taken over their whole identity. It's taken over their whole soul and who they are. And one of the things that I know from my experience is that the foremost practitioners of what we call replacement theology are Palestinian Christians. So at some level, their hearts have to be changed. And in our relationships with the Palestinian Christian community, we need to move beyond simply comforting them, and we need to challenge them to see the opportunity staring before them to redefine their relationship with Israel. So I'm going to stop there, and there may be questions, discussion, and what have you, but I didn't want to go on too long.
That was a great opening. Thank you for that. A lot of context, Canon Cox. Question for you. When we talk about the Palestinian Arab Christian community, it seems that their sense of victimhood is selective, because if you go to Gaza and talk to what at one point were the 2,000 or 2,500 Christians in Gaza, you would find massive Hamas assaults, rhetorical assaults, ideological assaults, and physical assaults against Christian homes and businesses in Gaza, and as well as in Bethlehem, which at the beginning of Oslo was 85% Christian, and today it's about 15% Christian and about 85% Muslim. And so you see a lot of the self-declared victimization seems to be selective when it comes to what they call the occupation, even though Hamas de facto was its own semi-sovereign state run by the Muslim Brotherhood branch in the Palestinian area. So how is it, in your view, from knowing the Palestinian Christian community in Bethlehem and Ramallah so well, that they don't even admit to you that the radical Islamist assault upon them as Christians in the Palestinian area is Hamas? They're the villains and not Israel.
That's a great question, Dan. Let me illustrate it with something that happened during a meeting I was leading between a group of Syriac Christian leaders from Syria and Israelis. This meeting was in Cyprus. And at one point, I was laying out the ground rules, and I said that one of the goals of the meeting was to find proper alignment between the Syriac Christian community and Israel. And the Israelis were in shock when I said this. And they said to the Syriac Christians, "Do you agree with what he's saying?" And the foreign minister of the Syriac Unity Party said, "Yes, we do. In fact, you need to understand that we don't harbor any hostility towards you. But what you don't, he said, what you don't understand is that we have had to take on the hostility of the majority community just to survive."
Mm.
And that was when a light went on for both the Israelis and me, when we realized that in many ways the Christians, because they are small, the first time I was there in Israel was in 1978. The Christian community was about 30%. Today, they're 1.6%. So just to survive, regardless of how they're treated, they have to take on the hostility of the majority community just to survive. And if you don't understand that reality, you don't understand the situation of the Palestinian Christians. Does that mean that their hostility toward Israel isn't real? No, but you have to understand the source of it.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point, Canon Cox. It's what Natan Sharansky, the once Anatoly Sharansky, prisoner of Zion, he described together with Ron Dermer when they wrote the book, The Case for Democracy, and they presented it to President Bush and Secretary of State Condi Rice back in 2003, 2004. And Sharansky called the Soviet Union a fear society as opposed to a free society. And as you described so eloquently, Canon, he said that in a fear society, the minorities have to adopt the propagandistic narrative of the majority culture just to stay alive in a fear society. So it rings true what you've shared with us.
One of the opportunities that I've tried to help Israelis to see is that with the shakeup in the Arab world, it actually opened up opportunities to develop friendships in the region that didn't exist before. On one occasion, I was working on a project in northern Iraq with Christian, Yazidi, Shabak, and Turkmeni political leaders. And the leader of the Nineveh Plains Christian community was taking us up to the front line with ISIS. And during the drive, I said to him, "You know, Yusuf, you can't always rely on the United States, and you might need to think about cultivating other friendships around the Middle East." And he was a smart guy. He said, "You mean Israel?" And I said, "Precisely." And he says, "I've thought about going to Israel. I would like to go to Israel, but this is not the time. But I know that one day I will go to Israel." So there are opportunities for strategic friendship out there once people get free of the kind of the neighborhood bully. So this is the reality that you're dealing with there.
Go ahead.
On one occasion in Jordan, I met with a group of senior Christian leaders led by a woman from the Jordanian parliament. And I listened to their complaints about how they were treated by the Muslims there. And mostly their complaints against the Muslim Brotherhood. And I knew most of the people they were complaining about. And after dinner, they said to me, "We would like your response to what we have said." So I asked them, I said, "Do you think that God can change the hearts of the Muslim Brotherhood from hating to loving?" do you believe that God can change the hearts of the Muslim Brotherhood from hating to loving? So they began to talk amongst themselves. And finally they said, no, we don't believe this. I said, then you have no future here. You might as well emigrate to Europe or the States or Canada or Australia.
So one of the few
places. This is their plight. Sorry.
One of the few places, Canon Cox, that the Christian community is actually flourishing is actually in Israel. Even the Israeli Arab Christian community is growing. I think at the fastest rate in the Middle East, at least, the Christian community. And yet we see some of the same, almost the same fear rhetoric that we hear from the Christian communities living under the Palestinian Authority and in those areas, as we do from the Christian leaders who live in Israel, really focusing also on the idea of the religious base in the old city around the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. How do you explain that animosity, which is really adopting a foreign narrative and really a hateful narrative?
Explain which narrative?
The narrative that's been adopted by some of the leadership of the Israeli Arab Christian population.
Well, first of all, you have to realize that they are impacted by the Palestinian community on the West Bank more than you realize. Mm-hmm. And so they're caught, on the one hand, given a choice, most Arab Christians would choose to be citizens in Israel rather than citizens in an Islamic state of Palestine. And so, you know, they have pressures on them that we don't always understand. And if they're seen as being too friendly with Israel, things may not go well for them. Because there are pressures from the West Bank that even though they're within Israel, they often have relatives and friends. And for example, like the Anglicans that are actually in Israel proper are part of the Diocese of Jerusalem, which is, of course, largely based in the West Bank. So you have that interaction between Arab Palestinians on the West Bank and those who are citizens and live in Israel proper. So they're not uninfluenced by those folks. And, you know, one of my own colleagues in the Anglican Church is a priest by the name of Naim Atik. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him.
Yeah, sure. Naim Atik, but Naim Atik was very involved in supersessionism, Palestinian supersessionism, as we're aware, as part of the sort of civil society opposition to Israel.
Well, and his colleague Mitri Rahab, and I know both of these men, and they have tremendous influence. You know, particularly Naim has influence in the Anglicans, and the Anglicans influence the others. So, you know, the previous bishop in Jerusalem, Suhail Dawani, who was initially my friend, but he became increasingly uncomfortable with my involvement on the political side, but also there were some that, you know, saw me simply as a Christian Zionist. And so, you know, he would keep his distance that way, playing it safe. So I don't know if that, Maurice, if that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. It's a political, religious, and community pressure that's a theme that you've brought up here that affects Israeli Christians or Christians living in Israel who are Israeli and non-Israeli, as well as Christians living under the Palestinian Authority, which is basically governed by Sharia law, which we know. I'd like to ask Canon Cox, as someone who's met with Hamas, I've heard from Arabs and Jewish Israelis that they did not understand the depth of the savagery, of the barbarism of the October 7th atrocities. I think much of which our friends in the West, unless they've seen the unedited version of the Hamas body cams, the GoPro cams that they themselves documented, which actually, I think, makes the Nazi atrocities that were hidden from the public, both in Germany and internationally, seem pale in comparison to the savagery that went on October 7th. To what degree were you surprised, as someone who's met with them, at the degree of barbarism and savagery that included, of course, mass rape of children, and beheadings of children, burnings of babies, live children, the evidence is being revealed more and more as the days go by, because the investigations and the interviews are exposing the depth of the savagery that I think the Western world certainly is just simply unimaginable.
During the 13 years that I worked with the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan with the senior leadership there, my goal was to try to encourage them to take on a different role as peacemakers, reconcilers, and problem solvers, which people normally didn't associate the Muslim Brotherhood with. And I even told that to them. And one has to understand that within the Brotherhood, like in Jordan, there's 4 different factions, and I was not dealing with the most hardline faction. But one of the things I learned from the leader, I won't say his name, but one of the things I learned is that he had come back from the International Shura Council of the Brotherhood and had said that they had come to the realization that the teachings of Sayyid Qutb had led them in a destructive direction, and that they were looking for a new direction. This was a very key thing. Now, during this time, I convinced them to take part in one of our faith-based reconciliation workshops, which had quite an impact on them. What I didn't know at the time was that 3 of the participants had been 3 of the founders of Hamas, along with Sheikh Yassin. And this opened the door for me to get to know them, to be in their homes. And at one time I said that if they, it's a long story, but I said that if you really want to make a difference in the region, the only way you can do it is by loving your enemies, the Israelis. And no matter how much I tried, I could see that there was a settled conviction of hatred in their hearts toward Israelis. And that was when I began to realize that they had given over their hearts to evil. Now, in my work, I don't use the word evil very lightly. There have been few times in my life, such as in Serbia and other places, where I've come face to face with evil. But that night in that home, I realized I was sitting face to face with evil. Now, all this is to say that what happened on October 7th was not really a surprise to me, nor should it have been a surprise to Israelis and to the Jewish community. I think one of the challenges for the Jewish community is to get them to wake up. One of my colleagues with IFBD, who shall remain nameless, is a Muslim, and his specialty is in de-radicalization of jihadis. And he has been in the prisons of India with Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And he said this, he said, when I'm in their presence, I feel that I'm in the presence of evil.
Mhm.
He said, most people don't realize that in the Islamist network, they talk openly about Holocaust 2.0, of finishing what Hitler started. Now, my sense is that this was the first salvo of that effort. That's why what you saw on October 7th is not the end, it's the beginning. And that's why the Jewish community needs to wake up to the reality of what they're facing. It's larger and more directed than you think. And I'm not trying to be an alarmist or to frighten you, but I think this is something to be taken very seriously as a long-term threat to the Jewish community. And that's why Christians need to take this just as seriously.
What Canon Cox just said now, Dan, is an unbelievable insight, which not only comes from the point of view of speaking to these people and understanding where they're coming from, but it fits into the reality when you have Hamas leaders saying openly that October 7th was just this, exactly what Canon Cox said. This is just the start, and we intend to do it over and over again. And really, it is very, very difficult to understand that level of evil that someone could openly say that they would like to again behead babies and rape people and murder people and burn people alive. But that seems to be the reality that we need to listen to.
Yeah, but Canon Cox is saying something even beyond another October 7th and another, which we heard Hamas leadership say. Yeah. Canon Cox, if I understand him correctly, is saying that this jihad, this holy war, is against the Jews, not only the Jews in Israel, but the Jews as a nation, the Jews as a people.
It's existential.
And believe them. Believe them. When my colleague was talking about this when we were together in India, the enormity of what he was saying began to hit me. And when we were sharing this with an Israeli NGO that we were thinking of working with, we could see that the shock of what he was saying, they couldn't absorb. And I realized that the enormity of this for the Jewish community to realize there tends to be a thinking, well, we can find a way to coexist here. We can make peace with the Palestinians. We can figure out a two-state solution. This is not grasping the reality of what is out there.
And you're talking about Islamists all over the region. I mean, not just Arab Islamists, but you're talking about Islamists in some of the, in Pakistan and
India, Afghanistan, the Philippines. When people try to engage with the Muslim world, they tend to engage with the most liberal Muslims. The trouble is they have no influence, because the most influential narrative in the Islamic world is the Islamist narrative, even though I wouldn't categorize everyone as Islamists. But that is the most influential narrative, and that's what has to be transformed.
How do you go about doing that? I mean, as somebody, as a leader, a faith leader yourself, and you've been face to face with these people, is it possible for Islam to reform itself? Professor Bernard Lewis, who is a dear friend and mentor to us at the JCPA, he said this is Islam's business. Islam is, no one from the outside can help Islam reform itself. It must make its own decisions by the leaders of its ulema, the leaders of its, it requires a complete reassessment and re-engagement with the Quran, and to begin to reassign or re-engage with the Quran among among Muslim leadership, and to be brave and courageous to make statements that would that would compete with some of the more extreme
link
statements of
really
Islam.
back to their
Yeah,
roots
that would-
rather than this division and really death wish that is being pushed also by Iran. And let's face it, that form of radical Islam is being pushed and funded and really promoted by Iran, and that whole idea of Iran, of Islam overrunning the whole world, starting with the Iranian Revolution.
Well, I think in a sense, Bernard Lewis is correct that it will take Muslims to reform Islam, but it won't just happen on its own. There has to be an intentionality about it, and you have to replace it with something. And typical, many Muslims see the reform of Islam along the lines of the secularization that happened in Europe in the Christian community. I can tell you that's a non-starter in the Muslim world. And my colleague has really actually developed a frame for how to provide an alternative vision of what Islam is about, really going back to the original roots of Islam. And what you have to do is build a movement in the Islamic world. It takes time. This Islamist narrative has been around since the 13th century, and it's finally surfacing. People who say, well, this is a reaction to Western colonialism don't know their history, because this has been around since the 13th century. So I think there's really two stages here. One is the reform of Islam, which means encouraging Muslims to go back to the Quran themselves rather than just listening to the sermons in the mosque. Second, it's encouraging critical thinking in the Islamic world. Third, it's encouraging them to re-embrace the original culture of Islam, which is described in Surah 1 of the Quran, of love, care, and mercy, God's culture of love, care, and mercy, and that this is an expression of God's sovereignty. The fourth thing is encouraging them to see Islam as a global force for peacemaking, reconciliation, and problem solving. This is really what Reformation looks like. And the second stage is really developing strategic friendship between Israel and the Muslim world. This is when they will really begin to rediscover their roots. Whether you understand it or not, Islam is another form of replacement theology at its roots. Mm-hmm. They believe they are now the latest revelation. Jews and Christians need to embrace Islam to be part of the true religion, that Islam has replaced Israel. Islam has replaced the Christian church. And in Islamic thinking, Israel doesn't exist. This is Islamic territory, and Jerusalem is an Islamic city. That's how they think. When I sat with the leader of the Islamic Action Front in Amman one day in his office, he had a mural of Jerusalem on his wall, and I asked him, I said, well, what does that mean to you? And he started to cry. And he said, oh, I dream of the day when Palestine will be an Islamic state and Jerusalem will be an Islamic city once again. And I said, well, what about the Jews? What about the Christians? He said, let them go elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Unbelievable.
Take that vision seriously.
Yeah. Canon Cox, you've spoken on the one hand of the need to defeat evil, and on the other hand, the need to embrace enemies and try to impose upon them a different vision. A number of our members of our audience who are really become colleagues over the last 60 days, as not just an audience, have asked questions like Ram Roth and Lisa Curson and Brian Gore and others have pointed to the question of, can any of this change be affected before the physical defeat of bad actors, of genocidal anti-Semitic jihadists in the Hamas, in the Hezbollah, the Houthis, and others who simply are, true believers and are not subject to any kind of moral or intellectual reform, but must be defeated before anything in Islam can really happen of import?
Well, although I work with a values-based form of diplomacy, I'm also a realist. And I know that from a military standpoint, Israel needs to do exactly what it's doing in terms of dismantling Hamas as an organization. But don't think for 1 second that you will have defeated the ideology behind it. That's an important thing, because the ideology is both spiritual and global, and it has to be addressed from that standpoint. Does Israel need to defeat Hamas? Certainly it does. The Houthis, but this is all being run from Iran. Let's be honest. And ultimately, this is going to involve dealing with Iran. And what's the strategy for dealing with that? So on the one hand, yes, it's a military question, and Hamas as an organization and their ability to carry out this kind of depravity against the state of Israel cannot be tolerated. I don't think there's any way that Israel can coexist with Hamas. At the same time, don't fool yourself into thinking that that the ideology is dead, because it isn't. It's spiritual and it's global. Mm-hmm. You think about it, the hatred of Jews has no rational basis to it. Because you're dealing with a spiritual reality in people's hearts.
One of the things, Canon Cox, just maybe to bring it down a little, the conversation, I apologize for bringing it down a little bit, but as we come into the holiday season, one of the regular claims that we're going to see and hear is that Jesus was the first Palestinian abused by the Jews, and the first martyr. What would you say to the people who make that claim, who put that out there and say, this is the real historical fact?
Well, first of all, it's not just a conflict narrative, it's a lie. Because what they forget is that Jesus himself was Jewish, and the first followers of Jesus were all Jews. They seem to forget that fact. The Palestinians seem to forget that fact. So they would describe themselves as the first followers of Jesus, which in fact is not true.
And yet it's made so often, unfortunately. As I said previously, I'm the whip in the office, and our time has unfortunately gone so quickly, but run out. And we now need to bid you farewell. Thank you very, very much for joining us. And stay safe, everyone.
Yeah, and we'll be in touch with you, Canon Cox. We have a lot of work to do together.
Great.
The Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs is opening our own, we have our own Arabic, Persian, and English media communications center right here at JCPA to communicate the correct messages and content to people of goodwill across the region. And we have many, many, many Arab allies, both public and under the radar and private, that have subscribed to some of these ideas that you're speaking about. We want to be communicating, messaging, research-based policy initiatives, as well as stories and interviews and documentaries to our neighbors in the Palestinian areas, as well as the Israeli Arab community in Arabic. I think this is critical for all of us to be communicating in the native language and political culture of the region, of the majority region, which is a Muslim Arab majority region. Israel is an indigenous member of this region, and many of them have asked us for daily Arabic content based on Israel and the Jewish people's rights, and to have been here as an indigenous member of the region. So we look forward to a lot of work and a strong future, which is possible even in these very dangerous times.
Thank you very much. And I look forward to working together on this, because we need to think long term and build strategic friends for Israel around the globe. Not just fair weather friends, but friends of the heart.
Indeed, so
Thank you so
Thank you very
much.
much.
Thank you.